Many thousands of years ago, the first people arrived in the Americas. They likely crossed a land bridge from Asia to North America. This bridge, called Beringia, is now covered by the Bering Strait. These early people spread out across two vast continents. They adapted to many different environments. From icy tundras to dense rainforests, they built lives. Over time, these groups developed into diverse cultures and societies. They spoke hundreds of different languages. They had unique traditions and ways of understanding the world. Their deep connection to the land shaped their existence and their beliefs. One of the earliest known major civilizations was the Olmec. They lived in the tropical lowlands of south-central Mexico. This was around 1400 BCE to 400 BCE. The Olmec are famous for their giant stone heads. These heads were carved from basalt and could be very tall. They also built large earthen mounds and pyramids. The Olmec developed complex religious practices and art styles. They may have been the first civilization in Mesoamerica to develop a writing system. Their influence spread to later cultures in the region, earning them the name Mother Culture of Mesoamerica. Further south, the Maya civilization flourished. They lived in what is now southern Mexico, Guatemala, Belize, and Honduras. The Maya classic period lasted from about 250 CE to 900 CE. They built impressive cities with stone pyramids and palaces. Tikal and Palenque were major centers. The Maya were skilled mathematicians and astronomers. They developed a very accurate calendar system. They also had a complex hieroglyphic writing system. Much of their history and knowledge was recorded in books and on stone monuments. Their society was structured with kings, priests, and commoners. In central Mexico, the Aztec Empire rose to power much later, from the 14th to 16th centuries CE. Their capital city was Tenochtitlan, built on an island in Lake Texcoco. It was a large and complex city with canals and temples. The Aztecs were fierce warriors and expanded their empire through conquest. They had a rich mythology and practiced human sacrifice. Further south, in the Andes Mountains of South America, the Inca Empire thrived. From the 13th to 16th centuries CE, they built a vast empire. It stretched for thousands of miles. The Inca were master builders, known for their road system and stone architecture like Machu Picchu. They used a system of knotted cords called quipu for record keeping. North America was also home to many diverse indigenous tribes, each with unique cultures and ways of life. For centuries, the peoples of the Americas lived without sustained contact with Europe, Asia, or Africa. There were some early voyages. Vikings from Scandinavia reached North America around 1000 CE. They even established small settlements like l'Anse aux Meadows in Newfoundland. However, these Norse settlements did not last long. They did not lead to permanent connections between the continents. The vast Atlantic Ocean remained a significant barrier. European nations were primarily focused on trade routes to Asia. They sought spices, silks, and other valuable goods. These goods usually traveled overland, which was long and costly. In the late 15th century, European explorers began to seek new sea routes to Asia. Christopher Columbus, an Italian mariner, believed he could reach the East Indies by sailing west across the Atlantic. Financed by the Spanish monarchs, Ferdinand and Isabella, he set sail in 1492. He landed on an island in the Caribbean, mistakenly believing he'd reached Asia. This voyage marked the beginning of lasting European contact with the Americas. It opened a new era of exploration, conquest, and colonization. Columbus made several more voyages, exploring more of the Caribbean. His arrival had devastating consequences for the indigenous populations. Following Columbus, Spain quickly moved to conquer and colonize vast territories. Hernán Cortés led an expedition that resulted in the fall of the Aztec Empire in Mexico between 1519 and 1521. Francisco Pizarro achieved a similar feat against the Inca Empire in Peru in the 1530s. The Spanish conquistadors had several advantages. They possessed superior weapons like steel, swords, firearms, and horses. European diseases such as smallpox and measles, to which Native Americans had no immunity, caused massive epidemics. Millions died, severely weakening indigenous societies. Some indigenous groups also allied with the Spanish against their local rivals, aiding the conquests. Other European powers soon joined the race to claim lands in the New World. France began exploring North America in the early 16th century. Jacques Cartier explored the St. Lawrence River. The French established colonies like Quebec and Montreal. They focused primarily on the fur trade and developed extensive networks with Native American tribes. England also established colonies along the Atlantic coast of North America. The first permanent English settlement was Jamestown, Virginia, founded in 1607. The Pilgrims founded Plymouth Colony in Massachusetts in 1620. These English colonies developed different economic bases, from tobacco farming in the south to trade and small farming in the north. The Spanish established vast colonial empires in Central and South America and parts of North America. These were organized into viceroyalties governed by officials appointed by the Spanish king. A key institution was the encomienda system. This system granted Spanish settlers the right to demand labor and tribute from indigenous communities. It often led to brutal exploitation. The Spanish extracted immense wealth, especially silver from mines like Potosi in Bolivia and Zacatecas in Mexico. Colonial society was highly stratified. A strict social hierarchy based on race and place of birth emerged. Peninsulares, born in Spain, held the highest positions, followed by Creoles, people of Spanish descent born in the Americas. French colonial society in North America, known as New France, developed differently. It was less focused on large-scale settlement and resource extraction like mining. The French primarily engaged in the fur trade. This required cooperation and alliances with indigenous peoples. French traders, known as coureurs des bois, often lived among native communities and intermarried. The population of New France grew slowly compared to the English colonies. English colonies along the Atlantic coast were diverse. Some, like Virginia, focused on cash crops like tobacco, relying heavily on indentured servants and later enslaved Africans. Others, in New England, developed around small farms, fishing and trade. The economic systems of the European colonies were largely shaped by mercantilism. This theory held that colonies existed to enrich the mother country. Colonies provided raw materials and served as markets for manufactured goods from Europe. This led to the development of plantation economies in many parts of the Americas. Large farms or plantations grew crops like sugar, tobacco, cotton and coffee. These were labor-intensive crops. The demand for labor fueled the transatlantic slave trade. Millions of Africans were forcibly brought to the Americas and subjected to brutal conditions of slavery. The triangular trade connected Europe, Africa and the Americas, exchanging goods and enslaved people. As European empires expanded in the Americas, they often came into conflict with each other. One of the most significant conflicts was the French and Indian War. This war was fought between Great Britain and France from 1754 to 1763. It was part of a larger global conflict known as the 7 Years' War. Both sides allied with various Native American tribes. The British eventually defeated the French. France lost most of its territory in North America to Britain and Spain. The war had major consequences. It increased Britain's debt, leading to new taxes on its American colonies. This, in turn, fueled growing resentment and contributed to the American Revolution. The late 18th and early 19th centuries were a time of revolutionary change in the Americas. Ideas from the Enlightenment played a crucial role. Thinkers like John Locke and Jean-Jacques Rousseau promoted concepts of natural rights, liberty, and popular sovereignty. They argued that governments should derive their power from the consent of the governed. These ideas spread throughout the Americas. They inspired many people to question colonial rule and seek self-determination. Grievances against colonial powers such as economic restrictions, lack of political representation and social inequalities fueled the desire for independence. The success of one revolution often inspired others. The American Revolution from 1775 to 1783 was one of the first major independence movements. The 13 British colonies in North America protested against taxation without representation and other British policies. Tensions escalated into armed conflict. Leaders like George Washington, Thomas Jefferson, and Benjamin Franklin guided the revolutionary cause. The colonists declared their independence in 1776. With French assistance, they defeated the British. The Treaty of Paris in 1783 recognized the United States of America as an independent nation. the American Revolution created a new republic based on principles of democracy and individual rights, though these were not extended to all inhabitants. A particularly radical and transformative independence movement occurred in the French colony of Saint-Domingue, now Haiti. Saint-Domingue was the wealthiest colony in the Americas. Its wealth was built on sugar plantations worked by hundreds of thousands of enslaved Africans. Inspired by the French Revolution, a massive slave revolt began in 1791. Toussaint Louverture, a formerly enslaved man, emerged as a brilliant military and political leader. After years of brutal fighting against French, Spanish and British forces, Haiti declared its independence in 1804. It became the first independent black republic in the world. The Haitian Revolution sent shockwaves across the Americas, terrifying slaveholders and inspiring enslaved people. Inspired by the American and Haitian revolutions and fueled by local grievances, independence movements spread across Spanish America. The Napoleonic Wars in Europe weakened Spain's control over its colonies. Creole elites, resentful of Spanish authority, led many of these struggles. Figures like Simón Bolívar in the north and José de San Martin in the south played pivotal roles. They led armies across vast territories, fighting numerous battles against Spanish royalist forces. By the 1820s, most of Spanish America had gained independence. New nations like Mexico, Gran Colombia, which later became Colombia, Venezuela and Ecuador, Peru, Chile and Argentina were formed. Brazil also gained independence from Portugal relatively peacefully in 1822. Section 5. Nations taking shape, expansion, conflict and industry in the 19th century. The 19th century was a period of significant nation-building and transformation across the Americas. In the United States, the idea of manifest destiny fueled westward expansion. This belief held that the US was destined to expand its territory across the North American continent. The Louisiana Purchase in 1803 nearly doubled the size of the country. Expeditions like that of Lewis and Clark explored these new lands. Settlers moved west in search of land and opportunity. This expansion came at a great cost to Native American populations. They were forcibly removed from their ancestral lands, often through treaties and violent conflict. The Trail of Tears is a tragic example of this displacement. The United States faced its greatest internal crisis with the Civil War from 1861 to 1865. Deep divisions existed between the northern and southern states, primarily over the issue of slavery. Economic differences and debates about states' rights also contributed to the conflict. Southern states seceded from the Union to form the Confederacy. The war was incredibly bloody and destructive. President Abraham Lincoln issued the Emancipation Proclamation, freeing slaves in Confederate territory. The Union victory preserved the nation and led to the abolition of slavery. The period of Reconstruction followed, aiming to rebuild the South and integrate formerly enslaved people into society. But it faced many challenges. Industrialization began to reshape economies and societies in parts of the Americas during the 19th century. The United States experienced rapid industrial growth, particularly after the Civil War. New technologies like the steam engine and the telegraph spurred development. Factories multiplied, producing textiles, steel and other goods. Railroads expanded across the continent, connecting distant markets. Cities grew rapidly as people moved from rural areas and immigrated from Europe and Asia in search of work. This industrialization created great wealth, but also led to new social problems, such as poor working conditions and urban crowding. In Latin America, the 19th century was often marked by political instability and economic challenges. Newly independent nations struggled to establish stable governments. The period saw the rise of caudillos, strong military leaders who often ruled as dictators. Economic development was often dependent on the export of raw materials such as coffee, sugar and minerals to Europe and North America. This created a reliance on foreign markets and investment. Some industrial growth occurred in countries like Brazil, Argentina and Mexico, but it was generally slower and more limited than in the United States. Border disputes and internal conflicts also hindered progress in many regions. Section 6: A century of change, progress, wars, and economic turmoil. The early 20th century brought significant social and political changes to the United States. This period is often known as the Progressive Era. Reformers sought to address the problems created by industrialization and urbanization. They advocated for better working conditions, regulation of big businesses, and conservation of natural resources. Muckraking journalists exposed corruption and social ills. Key achievements included women's suffrage, with the passage of the 19th Amendment granting women the right to vote. Pure food and drug laws were enacted. Efforts were made to break up monopolies and ensure fairer economic practices for all citizens. Global conflicts soon drew the Americas onto the world stage. World War I erupted in Europe in 1914. The United States initially remained neutral. However, events like the sinking of the Lusitania and Germany's unrestricted submarine warfare led to US entry into the war in 1917. American troops and resources played a significant role in the Allied victory. The war boosted the US economy and enhanced its international standing. Many Latin American countries also declared war on the Central Powers or broke diplomatic relations, though their direct military involvement was limited. The war did, however, impact their trade and economies, disrupting traditional European markets. The 1920s, often called the Roaring Twenties, were a period of economic prosperity and cultural dynamism in the United States. New technologies like automobiles and radios became widespread. Jazz music and new social freedoms characterized the era. However, this prosperity was not evenly distributed. It ended abruptly with the stock market crash of 1929. This event triggered the Great Depression, the worst economic downturn in modern history. Banks failed, businesses closed, and unemployment soared. Millions of people lost their jobs and homes. The Depression had a devastating global impact, affecting economies across the Americas and around the world. The Great Depression contributed to political instability in many countries and set the stage for World War II. The war began in Europe in 1939 with Germany's invasion of Poland. The United States again initially pursued neutrality. However, the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor on December 7, 1941, propelled the US into the conflict. The Americas played a crucial role in the Allied war effort. The US mobilized its vast industrial capacity to produce weapons and supplies. Millions of Americans served in the armed forces. Latin American countries largely supported the Allies, providing resources and some military assistance. The war ended in 1945, leaving the US as a dominant global superpower. Section 7. The Shadow of the Cold War, Superpowers and Revolutions. After World War II, a new global conflict emerged, the Cold War. This was an intense ideological and geopolitical rivalry between the United States and the Soviet Union. The US championed democracy and capitalism. The Soviet Union promoted communism. While there was no direct large-scale fighting between the two superpowers, the conflict was waged through proxy wars, an arms race, and propaganda. The development of nuclear weapons created a constant threat of mutual destruction. The world became largely divided into two opposing blocs. This division profoundly influenced international relations and domestic policies in countries across the globe for decades. The United States exerted significant influence in Latin America during the Cold War. US foreign policy focused on preventing the spread of communism in the Western Hemisphere. This was often framed within the context of the Monroe Doctrine, which asserted US dominance in the region. The US government supported anti-communist governments, even if they were authoritarian dictatorships. It also intervened, sometimes covertly and sometimes overtly, in the affairs of Latin American nations. Examples include the CIA-backed coup in Guatemala in 1954 and support for anti-Castro efforts. These actions often created resentment and anti-American sentiment in the region. Revolutionary movements gained traction in several Latin American countries during this period. Many were inspired by Marxist ideas and sought to address issues of poverty, inequality, and foreign domination. The Cuban Revolution of 1959, led by Fidel Castro, was a landmark event. Castro overthrew the US-backed dictator Fulgencio Batista and established a communist state. Cuba became a close ally of the Soviet Union. The Cuban Revolution inspired other leftist guerrilla movements and political groups across Latin America. The US often responded by supporting counter-insurgency efforts. and promoting economic development programs like the Alliance for Progress, aimed at reducing the appeal of communism. The Cold War also had significant social and political impacts within the United States. The fear of communism led to a period known as the Red Scare, particularly in the late 1940s and 1950s. Senator Joseph McCarthy led aggressive campaigns to root out alleged communists in government and other institutions. This period, often called McCarthyism, resulted in blacklisting and ruined careers. The US also became involved in proxy wars in places like Korea and Vietnam, ostensibly to contain communism. These conflicts were costly in terms of lives and resources. They also sparked significant social unrest and anti-war protests within the United States itself. Section 8, Towards a New Millennium, Rights, Globalization, and Shifting Powers. The latter half of the 20th century witnessed powerful movements for civil rights and social justice across the Americas. In the United States, the African-American civil rights movement gained momentum in the 1950s and 1960s. Leaders like Martin Luther King Jr. advocated for an end to racial segregation and discrimination. Through nonviolent protests, marches, and legal challenges, the movement achieved landmark victories such as the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965. Similar movements emerged advocating for the rights of women, Native Americans, Hispanic Americans, and other marginalized groups, demanding equality and an end to systemic injustice. Economic globalization accelerated in the late 20th century. This involved increasing interconnectedness of economies through international trade, investment, and the flow of capital. Multinational corporations expanded their operations across borders. Technological advancements in communication and transportation facilitated this process. Trade agreements like the North American Free Trade Agreement, or NAFTA, signed by the US, Canada, and Mexico in 1994, aimed to reduce trade barriers. Globalization brought economic benefits to some, such as lower consumer prices and new markets. However, it also led to concerns about job losses in some industries and increased economic inequality. Many Latin American countries experienced a transition from authoritarian rule to democracy during the 1980s and 1990s. Military dictatorships that had seized power in countries like Chile, Argentina, Brazil, and Uruguay began to crumble. Popular pressure, economic difficulties, and international condemnation contributed to these changes. Democratic elections were held and civilian governments were restored. However, consolidating democracy proved challenging. New democratic institutions often faced issues like corruption, political instability, and economic crises. The legacy of human rights abuses under dictatorships also needed to be addressed through truth commissions and trials. The Cold War came to a dramatic end with the collapse of the Berlin Wall in 1989 and the dissolution of the Soviet Union in 1991. This marked a major turning point in world history. The United States emerged as the world's sole superpower for a period. The bipolar world order of the Cold War gave way to a more complex and multipolar international system. While the end of the Cold War brought hopes for a new world order characterized by peace and cooperation, new conflicts and challenges soon emerged. Ethnic conflicts, regional wars, and the rise of international terrorism became prominent features of the post-Cold War era. Section 9, The Americas Today, Global Roles and Enduring Challenges. In the 21st century, the nations of the Americas continue to play significant roles on the global stage. The United States remains a major economic, military, and cultural power. However, its global leadership is increasingly challenged by the rise of other nations, particularly China. The economies of the Americas are deeply integrated into the global system. They face both opportunities and vulnerabilities due to this interconnectedness. International cooperation is crucial for addressing shared global problems. Many Latin American nations have also increased their global engagement, forming regional blocs and participating more actively in international forums, seeking to diversify their partnerships. Despite progress in many areas, the Americas confront numerous social and political challenges. Economic inequality remains a persistent problem, both within countries and between them. Large disparities in wealth and income contribute to social unrest and limit opportunities for many people. Political polarization has intensified in several nations, making it difficult to find common ground and address pressing issues. Debates over immigration policies are ongoing, often fueled by economic concerns and cultural anxieties. Transnational organized crime, including drug trafficking and human trafficking, poses a serious threat to security and governance in many parts of the region. Environmental challenges are among the most critical issues facing the Americas today. Climate change is having a profound impact. More frequent and intense hurricanes, prolonged droughts, rising sea levels, and melting glaciers threaten communities and ecosystems. Deforestation, particularly in the Amazon rainforest, continues at an alarming rate, with severe consequences for biodiversity and global climate patterns. There is a growing recognition of the need for sustainable development practices. This means finding ways to promote economic growth while protecting the environment and ensuring social equity for future generations. International agreements and local initiatives are attempting to address these urgent concerns. Indigenous rights movements continue to advocate for justice and self-determination. Indigenous peoples across the Americas have long struggled for the recognition of their land rights, cultural heritage, and political autonomy. They seek to overcome centuries of colonization, discrimination, and marginalization. Efforts are underway in many countries to promote reconciliation and address historical injustices. These include land claim settlements, official apologies, and initiatives to preserve indigenous languages and cultures. The fight for indigenous rights highlights the ongoing quest for a more inclusive and equitable society in the Americas, acknowledging the rich diversity and complex history of these lands and their first peoples.